Hey, 42 here. The world is pretty big and incredibly diverse. So whenever you're somewhere and you think, it can't get much hotter or wetter or higher than this, it probably can. So where are the undisputed champions? Where are the most extreme places on Earth? First, let's look at the world's hottest place. Temperatures taken with thermometers on weather stations would have you believe that El Azizia in Libya, with its highest recorded temperature of 58 degrees C, or Death Valley in California with its record high reading of 56.7 degrees C, are the hottest places on Earth. But according to new satellite imagery data, they're not even serious contenders. There is a salt desert in the east of Arran that's about 480 kilometers wide and 320 wide, called Dasht-e-Lut, which, as of recently, is officially the hottest place on Earth. The surface of the sand here reaches a scorching 70.7 Celsius. That's almost double the temperature of your body. So I guess that begs the question, who is the poor scientist who had to sit out here with a thermometer and take a reading every day? I hope they had a fridge at least. Well, we know scientists can do some pretty crazy things sometimes, but no one is that crazy. The data actually comes from a NASA satellite called Aqua that monitors, among other things, the heat radiation of the Earth's surface. From 2003 to 2010, the satellite would image the entire planet every 1 to 2 days, giving us data on temperatures, clouds, winds, and much more. The local name for the desert is Gandom Buryan, which means roasted grain. The story is that travelling farmers spilt their seeds on the sand, and within just a few days it was scorched and ruined by heat before it could be collected. Not that you get a lot of people travelling through, it's certainly no picnic out there, but people do come to see the beautiful otherworldly sandcastles in the western corner of the desert. The erosion has carved teetering towers that make it seem like some lost ancient city. Right, so if that got you feeling a little hot under the collar, let's all cool off by heading in the opposite direction. The coldest place on Earth. The lowest recorded temperature is minus 89.2 degrees Celsius, taken in 1983 at the Soviet Vostok station. But the station was just there to make these measurements, so, you know, the scientists were being paid to be there in cold, hard cash. Very cold, hard cash. But imagine if your whole town chose to live like this. Oymyakon is the oldest permanent settlement on Earth, with some 500 people living in freezing temperatures up in the northeastern tip of Russia. In winter, it has got as low as minus 67.7 degrees, and typically averages minus 45 Celsius in December and January. The craziest thing is that, unlike Antarctica, where you're lucky if you ever get above minus 30 Celsius, even in summer, Oymyakon has hit plus 34.6 degrees Celsius in July, and normally averages around 20 C for the summer months. Imagine trying to buy a yearly wardrobe that covered a difference of 100 Celsius. Enough about temperature, we're moving on to new heights, or just really high heights. So, what is the world's highest point? Now this seems like quite an obvious one, right? The highest point must be the highest mountain, which is, yep, that's right, Mount Everest in the Himalayas. But when we say the highest mountain, what do we really mean? Well, we mean that Everest peak is 8,848 meters above sea level, and no other mountain can match that. But if you measure from the base to the peak, which is quite hard to do because there isn't some nice red line that says the mountain starts here, then actually the tallest mountain is Mount MAUNA at a massive 10,203 meters, but it's deep in the Pacific Ocean. The first 6,000 meters of Mauna Kea are underwater, so it doesn't really help us to find the world's highest point. Let me introduce CHIMBORAZO. Okay, I know it's only 6,267 meters above sea level, but here's the twist. Its peak is the furthest away from the center of the Earth of any mountain. You know that globe you had in geography class that was a perfect sphere? Well, the Earth isn't actually like that. It bulges around the equator, so the land and the sea level are actually a few kilometers higher at these points than anywhere else. Since Chimborazo is in Ecuador, named for being right on the equator, it gets this little boost from the Earth's bulge. So it's actually 6,384.4 kilometers from the center of the Earth, which beats Everest. It's 6,382.3 kilometers from the Earth's center. In your face, Everest, you midget. So that's the highest point. But what about the lowest? The lowest place on the Earth's surface is the Dead Sea. It's not really a sea, it's more a really salty lake. 50 kilometers long and 15 wide, and it lies almost half a kilometer below sea level. 429 meters to be exact. It gets its name from the almost total lack of aquatic life there. You're more likely to find chips in it than fish. Its salt quantity is so high that swimmers just float on the surface like a human inflatable. But if we don't stick to the Earth's surface, we can find places much deeper. In the Pacific Ocean, just south of Japan, there is Mariana's Trench, and its lowest point is called Challenger Deep, and bottoms out at 10,916 meters below sea level. Here the pressure reaches over 1,000 times what it is at the surface. So unless you happen to be an invertebrate or other soft-bodied organism, you will probably end up as soup under the immense pressure that deep underwater. Have you ever had that feeling when you're at the top of a really high building or say a waterfall and you wonder what it would feel like if you jumped? Well, you're not alone. It's often called the high place phenomenon, and some psychologists think it's your brain getting confused by the feeling of dizziness and vertigo, even though no realistic threat is being posed. So imagine what it would feel like if you took a trip to the top of Mount THOR, the world's greatest vertical drop. This gigantic cliff face can be found on Baffin Island in Canada and boasts a 1,250 meter vertical drop. It would take the average person over 15 seconds to reach the bottom if they jumped off it. And because the world is a crazy place, people do jump off it. In fact, Baffin Island has become something of a hotspot for base jumpers who brave the Arctic conditions and polar bears to hop in a wingsuit and scream "Geronimo" as they take a wild plunge from THOR's peak. The thought of doing one of those jumps makes my mouth go dry. Do you know where else would do that? The driest place on Earth. Down the west coast of South America, tucked behind the Andes, lies a 1,000-kilometer strip called the Atacama Desert. It's so dry that it only receives around 15 millimeters of rain every year, and as little as 1 millimeter in some parts. That means if you spit on the ground, you're giving it more moisture than it'll see all year. This isn't just the recent recordings either. Geologists believe that it's been like this for some 200 million years. So, you never know, an Argentinosaurus could have come along and dribbled on the exact same dry spot. Surprisingly, the land isn't completely barren, and some plants and animals do exist, mainly around the edges of the desert. And some years, if you do enough rain dances and manage to get over the usual 15 millimeters of precipitation, then huge areas of the desert burst into colour. A variety of seeds and bulbs lay dormant through the dry years, but come alive in a visual symphony when the rains do finally return. When discussing dry places, we should also mention the dry valleys in Antarctica. In an enormous continent of whiteness, these are certainly a strange sight. Permanently ice-free valleys. Well, they do have a very small number of frozen lakes, but it's mainly just harsh, grey-looking dirt. The reason it's so dry is due to katabatic winds. The surrounding mountains block the flowing ice, and then, when cold air comes over the top, the gravity pulls it downwards, making it rip through the valleys at up to 320 kilometers per hour. This heats the air and evaporates all the ice and snow. This wind also whips up tiny stones and sandblasts the boulders into these beautiful carvings that look like enormous dinosaur skeletons. It gives it the feeling of being in an alien world. And in fact, because of their alien-like features, both the dry valleys of Antarctica and the Atacama Desert are used to test various NASA projects, such as the rovers for Mars and one of Jupiter's moons, Europa. If you want to escape these dry sci-fi landscapes, where better than the world's wettest place? Mawsynram, a village in northeastern India, holds the Guinness World Record as the world's wettest place, with a current average of 11,872 millimeters per year. To give you some perspective, that's 10 times what rainy old England normally averages. The cause of all this rain is related to the Khasi Hills, which are placed right in the path of airflow that comes from the Bay of Bengal. One key factor is that the air coming over the hills creates uplift and cooling, which increases the condensation. So it's like you're constantly pumping the clouds full of more water. The title of World's Wettest Place is actually contested by two towns in Colombia, Juro and Puerto Lopez. Juro had an average of 13,299 millimeters of rainfall for a few years in the 1950s, but the equipment was pretty outdated, so we don't know how much we can trust these figures. As for Puerto Lopez, although it has decent records to show a 12,892 millimeter precipitation average, there are some mums missing in the middle of 50 years of data, so unfortunately they cannot claim the title. Seems a bit harsh, but hey, if you're sitting inside all day, you should have time to do your filing properly. If you've forgotten your umbrella, maybe we should look for somewhere else for you to go. How about the world's highest permanent settlement? This honour goes to La RINCONADA in the Peruvian Andes. It sits at the bottom of the Sleeping Beauty Glacier and is a whopping 5,100 meters above sea level. It has a pretty stable climate and is typically a degree or two above freezing all year round. So what's the appeal for the 50,000 or so inhabitants? Well, it's one of mankind's old loves: gold. There are gold mines nearby, and this is where almost all of the economy comes from. But the way workers are paid is very strange. Most are part of the caserío system. This means they go 30 days unpaid, and then on the 31st day, they can take as much ore as they can carry and hope that they find gold in it. It's a complete lottery, of course, but it's common practice to pocket a promising looking stone even when it's not caserío day. As well as the peculiar payment system, the city is not the safest place either. There is no plumbing or sanitation system, and since mercury is used in the gold refinement process, the water is pretty contaminated. But hey, who needs toilets and non-toxic water if you've got yourself some shiny gold? And finally, if you really want to get away from it all, you need to head down to the most remote inhabited place on Earth. Around 300 people live on the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is 2,000 kilometers from its nearest neighbors on the island of St. Helena. That's a long way to paddle if you need to tell them to turn the music down. The nearest continental land is South Africa, some 2,400 kilometers away. It's actually a small cluster of islands. One is uninhabitable, some are just wildlife reserves, but the main island where people live is 98 kilometers squared, and these people are members of the British Commonwealth. The island was discovered by the Portuguese admiral Tristan da Cunha in 1506, but was only used as a stop-off point for merchants and whalers until the early 19th century. The British declared it part of its empire in 1816, due to two main concerns. Firstly, during the war with the United States, the US used it to launch attacks on British merchant fleets. And secondly, it was to stop Napoleon from escaping from St. Helena. Napoleon had already escaped once before, from a prison on Elba near Italy. So after the Battle of Waterloo, the British took no chances and sent him as far away as they could from anyone. The navy on Tristan da Cunha would patrol the waters and look out for any French attacks. Once Napoleon died from arsenic poisoning he got from his wallpaper, the fleet decided to stay there, and so the island has been inhabited ever since. It was briefly evacuated in 1961 when the island's volcano, Queen Mary's Peak, erupted. They have their own economy, largely from renting out their outland fishing waters. They also sell unique coins and postage stamps that are something of a collector's item. Since it's hard to trade when you live 2,000 kilometers away from everyone, most of their supplies come from 8 to 9 times a year from South African fishing boats. It makes ordering off Amazon a bit of a slow process. They do have internet access now though, since an internet cafe opened up in 2006. But the internet is so slow on the island that when someone wants to Skype a relative, the entire island has to turn off their internet access to free up bandwidth. Seriously. The world certainly is full of extreme places that push the limits and boggle the mind. But unless you want to be incredibly hot, perishingly cold, unnervingly high, incredibly dehydrated, completely soaked, or just really, really far from anyone, then you're probably best off staying right where you are. Thanks for the view, subscribe for more. 42.